Welcome to Caledonia Sleeps, your peaceful escape into the heart of Scotland. Tonight we wander through a quiet Highland glen. The moon is up, pale and full, casting its soft light across the heather. The hills on either side rise dark and patient into a sky scattered with stars. A burn runs somewhere below us, the one sound in all this silence that has not changed in 1,000 years. We walk slowly. There is no hurry here. The path beneath our feet is soft with old grass, and on either side of it, if you look carefully in the moonlight, you can make out the shapes of things, low mounds of stone, barely rising above the heather, rectangular shadows where walls once stood, the faintest suggestion of ridges in the earth, long parallel lines running across the floor of the glen like the memory of fields. This glen was filled with life once, 200 years ago, give or take a generation. There were houses here, fires burning inside them, children sleeping, cattle lowing softly in the dark. The smell of peat smoke drifting up into the same sky we are standing under now. The time that emptied this place is known as the Highland Clearances. It unfolded across more than a century, from roughly the 1760s to the late 1800s, and it touched almost every glen and island in the Scottish Highlands. It is one of the most enduring and sorrowful chapters in Scotland's story. We will not rush through it tonight. We will walk through it slowly, the way you walk through a place you want to understand and remember. So let your breathing slow. Let the moonlight settle around you. And let us begin at the beginning, with the world that was here before it was taken away. Stand still for a moment and let your eyes soften. Try to see it as it was, a cluster of low houses at the foot of the slope, their walls built from the same stone that lies all around us now, their roofs thatched with heather or rushes, held down against the Highland wind with ropes twisted from the same materials, small windows, thick walls, doors facing away from the prevailing weather. This was the clachan, the township, perhaps a dozen families, sometimes fewer, a burn nearby, cold and clear, the same burn we can hear now, the hills rising on every side, exactly as they rise tonight. Around the clachan, the arable land was divided in a system called runrig, strips of cultivated ground scattered across the shared field, reallocated periodically so that no one family kept the best soil forever, and no one was always burdened with the worst. You can still see the evidence of it here, those long ridges in the earth, the raised strips where the soil was turned, the hollows between them where the water drained. They are called lazy beds, though there was nothing lazy about them. They represent decades, sometimes centuries, of human labour pressed into the ground. Beyond the cultivated strips lay the common grazing. The cattle would have been up on the hillside in summer, moving through the bracken, their shapes dark against the pale sky. The cattle were everything. The great black cattle of the Highlands, hardy, shaggy creatures, were the foundation of the economy. In autumn they were driven south, hundreds of miles along ancient drove roads, to the great markets at Falkirk and Crieff. The money from the cattle paid the rent, kept the family through the long winter, and connected each small clachan to the wider world. But the deeper currency of this place was not money, it was Gaelic, the language in which children learned the names of hills, in which women sang to their spinning, in which stories of heroes and the fairy mounds were passed from grandmother to grandchild beside the peat fire. Gaelic was not merely a way of speaking, it was a way of inhabiting the world precisely, knowing which hill shoulder held the best late grass, which loch the thickest trout, which month the bog myrtle came into its brief, sharp-scented bloom. And above all, it was the clan. The chief's authority came not only from the wealth or law, but from the dukas, the inalienable right of clan members to live on the ancestral ground. It was not written in any statute. It was older than that. It was simply understood, as deeply as anything can be understood, as a truth of the world. In summer, the young people took the cattle to the high shielings, seasonal grazing grounds up near the tops, where the grass was sweet and the air thin and clean. They built small shelters called bothies and spent weeks living close to the sky, making butter and cheese, singing, telling stories. The older women sometimes went too, to oversee the dairying, and the evenings would have been filled with the firelight and voices carrying out across the open hill. Gaelic songs remember those summers as the brightest time of youth, the feeling of being high and free and far from trouble, the whole glen visible below, the sea a glimmer at the edge of the world. There is a Gaelic word called cianalis that does not translate easily. It means something like longing or homesickness, but deeper than that, a yearning for a place that is part of you, a grief for what cannot be recovered. It is the word that Highlanders who were cleared would carry with them across the ocean, the word that their grandchildren would feel without quite knowing why when they first looked out over a Highland loch. Cianalis, the ache of a place that has not let you go. The people who lived in this glen knew nothing of what was coming. The grandmother spinning by the fire, her grandchildren asleep on the box bed nearby did not know that within a generation all of this would be gone. The young man walking home from the shieling in the September dusk, the hills golden around him, did not know that the hills would still be golden long after everyone he loved had been scattered to coasts and cities and foreign shores. They simply lived here. That is a thing to hold on to. They simply lived here as fully as anyone has ever lived anywhere. That is the world we are walking through the ruins of tonight. Not a perfect world. It was hard and precarious and sometimes hungry, but it was alive, and it knew its own ground, and it had been here for a very long time. The forces that ended this world did not arrive all at once. They gathered slowly over decades, like weather building on the horizon. The defeat of the Jacobite rising at Culloden in 1746 was the first great blow. The battle lasted less than an hour on a bleak moorland east of Inverness, and when it was over, the old clan system began its long unravelling. Laws that followed stripped the chiefs of their traditional powers and pressed them toward becoming commercial landlords, men whose relationship with their people was no longer one of kinship and obligation, but of rent and profit. And in the late 1700s, the economics of the land shifted beneath everyone's feet. The Cheviot sheep, a new breed, heavier and more productive than anything previously raised in the north, could survive the Highland winters, and Cheviot wool was worth far more than the rent of a dozen poor farming families. The calculation was simple and devastating. Sheep did not need a clachan. They needed only grass and space and a handful of lowland shepherds. The land that held these communities for centuries could be emptied and given over to white flocks. So the evictions began. Some landlords moved their tenants to narrow coastal strips, hoping they might make a living from fishing and from burning kelp. The seaweed gathered from the shore and processed into an alkali, used in soap and glass. It was hard, exhausting work, done on plots of ground too thin to feed a family alone. But it was something, and for a few decades during the Napoleonic Wars, when demand for kelp was high, those coastal communities held together. Then the wars ended, cheap imports flooded in, the kelp trade collapsed overnight, and the landlords who had moved thousands of people to the coast now found themselves with communities they had no further use for, on land that could not sustain them. What followed was a second and darker wave of clearances. This time there was no resettlement offered. There was simply removal. As you stand here in this empty glen, that is the shape of what happened. Not one event, but a long accumulation of pressures, economic, political, agricultural, that bore down on communities that had no legal protection, no recourse, and no power to resist. Not far from where we are walking tonight, in the long, fertile valley of the River Naver, the Clearances reached their most notorious and terrible expression. The Sutherland estate was vast, close to 1.5 million acres, roughly half the entire county. Between 1811 and 1821, something in the region of 15,000 people were cleared from its lands. The estate's owners, the Countess of Sutherland and her husband Lord Stafford, believed genuinely, or told themselves they believed, that resettling their tenants on the coast would improve their lives. The factor who carried out the work, a lawyer named Patrick Seller, had no such sentimentary. He called the Gaelic-speaking people he was removing barbarous, and he moved through the strath with efficiency and fire. There was a young stonemason in Strathnaver in 1814, perhaps 20 years old, born in the village of Rossall. His name was Donald MacLeod. He watched what happened that summer, and for the rest of his long life, he could not stop writing about it. His account, published as Gloomy Memories in the Highlands of Scotland, first as letters to the Edinburgh Weekly Chronicle in the 1840s, then as a book in Toronto in 1857, is the only substantial first-hand account of the Clearances written from the perspective of those removed. It is a document of extraordinary power and pain, written by a man who understood that if he did not set it down, the truth of it might simply be lost. The landlords had lawyers and newspapers and commissioners on their side. The cleared people had Donald MacLeod and his long, furious, grieving memory. On the night of the 13th of June, 1814, MacLeod climbed a hill above the strath and counted 250 blazing houses. The fire lasted 6 days. Imagine that for a moment, standing here in this quiet, moonlit glen, and try to imagine this hillside lit orange from below, the smell of burning thatch and timber carrying on the night air, the sound of cattle in distress, and on the slopes above the smoke, the people of the township, women with children in their arms, old men who could barely walk, families who had lived in these houses for generations, watching everything they had ever known turn to ash. MacLeod described the scene in his own words. The women and children scattered over the hills, he wrote, the sick and the very old who could not move quickly, the confusion and the terror, the shepherds with their dogs, driving the cleared people's cattle through smoke and flame. And then the silence that followed, when the fires had done their work, and the strath lay open and empty in the summer light. If you walked Strathnaver today, and you can, it is a quiet single-track road heading north through Sutherland toward the sea. You would find it very like this glen, peaceful, the River Naver running clean and quick over its stones, the hills reflecting in the water, curlews calling from the bog, and beside the road, marked by a small historic Environment Scotland panel, the outlines of the cleared township of Rossall, MacLeod's own birthplace, its house platforms visible as grassy mounds, its old field system still legible as gentle ridges across the valley floor. The land remembers, even when there is no one left to speak. In one of the most terrible episodes of the 1814 clearances, the eviction party arrived at a house in Baden-Losken, occupied by a man named William Chisholm. Inside lay his elderly mother-in-law, a woman bedridden and too frail to be moved. MacLeod recorded that when the factor was informed of this, he ordered the house burned anyway. She was dragged outside. She died within days. Seller was charged with culpable homicide and arson and tried at Inverness in April 1816. He was acquitted by a jury of his peers, landowners and lawyers, after 15 minutes of deliberation. He went on to lease the cleared land himself and farm it profitably for sheep. Donald MacLeod was not called as a witness. We do not need to dwell long in that darkness tonight, but we should not move through it too quickly either. Those people were here. They were real. The ridges in this ground we are walking over were made by their hands, season after season, year after year. The names carved into the land around us are the names they gave it. Their grief is not a historical abstraction. It is as real as the stone beneath the heather. Come with me now along a different road, a single track winding through Strathnaver in Rossshire, past birch trees and fields, to a small whitewashed church at the head of the valley. Thomas Telford designed it, plain and spare and beautiful. It is called Croick Church, and it stands at the end of the road in a silence so complete you can hear the wind moving through the churchyard grass. On the 24th of May, 1845, 18 families came here, 90 people cleared from the Glen of Glencalvy to the south by a factor acting for the estate. They had been model tenants, no arrears, no trouble, nothing that could be held against them. They had watched the clearances moving through the surrounding glens for years, knowing their turn would come. When it came, they walked out of Glencalvy in a body, their children in carts, their few belongings alongside them. A correspondent from the London Times found them sheltering in the churchyard, huddled around a small fire between the gravestones, a makeshift tent of poles and tarpaulins, keeping the cold May drizzle off the children. They would not go inside the church. They believed it would be a desecration to shelter in a house of God without invitation, but some of them did something else, something that is still there. They scratched words into the diamond-shaped panes of the east window of the church. The writing is careful, deliberate, in copperplate. You can still read it today. Glencalvy people was in the church here, May 24, 1845, and The Glencalvy tenants resided here May 24, 1845, and the phrase that catches the breath every time, Glencalvy people, the wicked generation. They had internalised the shame placed on them by those with the power to name things. They believed, it seems, that they were being punished for some failing, that this was somehow deserved. Those words are still in the glass. You can visit Croick Church. The door is always unlocked, and put your fingers into the grooves cut by those hands in that cold May light more than 180 years ago. Stand in that churchyard at dusk, and you will feel how thin the boundary is between then and now. The same hills, the same wind, the same silence after the birds stop singing. There is a particular quality of light in the Highlands in the evening, especially in late spring, when the sun drops slowly behind the western hills and the sky holds its glow long after the sun itself is gone, a greenish gold, shifting slowly to rose, then to deep soft blue. The Gaelic word for it is camanish, the slow fading of light, the long dusk. It is a beautiful word for a beautiful thing, and the people of Glencalvy knew it well. They would have watched that light on every evening of their lives, from childhood to old age. The same light moving across the same hills, the same deepening of colour as the Glen settled toward night. They watched it on the evening of the 24th of May, 1845, from the churchyard of Croick, the children asleep on the makeshift bedding, the adults sitting quietly, or perhaps not quietly, perhaps still in shock, their minds struggling to understand how everything had changed in a single day. The last of the light fading from the hilltops, the cold coming in from the east. Someone lifted a small piece of metal, a pin, a nail, a knife point, and pressed it into the glass of the east window and began to write. For those who were cleared, the question that followed was always, where now? Some were offered passages to Canada or Australia, assisted emigration, the landlords called it, which was sometimes a genuine offer of a new start and sometimes simply the cheapest way of making a problem disappear. Some families chose to go, seeing no future in what remained. Others were given so little real choice that the distinction between choosing and being compelled is very hard to draw. Picture the shore they left from, a sea loch in the west, the hills coming steeply down on either side, the water grey-green and cold under an autumn sky, the smell of seaweed and salt, families gathered with whatever they could carry, a cooking pot, a bundle of clothing, a small box of seeds, perhaps a Bible with the family names written inside the front cover in careful copperplate. The last morning on the shore, the last look back at the hill. The Gaelic word for that kind of leaving is frackle. departure, abandonment, the act of being left or of leaving. The songs written about it do not romanticize it. They are simply inconsolable. One of the most famous of the emigrant ships was the Hector, which set sail in the summer of 1773 and arrived at Pictou, Nova Scotia, in September, carrying approximately 189 Highlanders from around Loch Broom. The crossing took 11 weeks. The conditions below deck were foul, overcrowded, poorly ventilated, the drinking water growing stale as the weeks wore on. Dysentery broke out first, then smallpox. 18 people died at sea, most of them children. When the survivors came ashore at Pictou, they found not the prepared land and cleared lots they had been promised, but wilderness, thick forest running down to the water's edge, no shelter, no roads, no fields. They had arrived too late in the season to plant. They survived their first Canadian winter on what charity they could find and on the generosity of the Mi'kmaq people who had lived in that country long before any of them had arrived. And yet they stayed. They cleared land with their hands. They built houses that kept out the Nova Scotia winter. They planted oats in soil they had never worked before, and they harvested them, and they survived. And in the long evenings, when the work was done, they sang the songs of the places they had left. They told the stories of the glens and the lochs. They kept the language alive in a new country because it was all they had left of the old one. Between 1815 and 1870, more than 50,000 Gaelic-speaking Highlanders emigrated to Nova Scotia and Cape Breton Island alone. The landscape there, the forested hills, the broad sea inlets, the long slanted winter light, is not so different from the one they left behind. They named their new townships for their old ones: Loch Broom, Inverness, Glencoe, Mabou, from the Gaelic. They planted themselves in that new ground and grew. In some pockets of Cape Breton, Gaelic survived longer than in parts of the homeland. There are people alive today in Nova Scotia and Cape Breton who learned Gaelic as their first language, from grandparents who had learned it from their grandparents who remembered Scotland. And there are people in Canada and Australia and New Zealand today who carry the name of a glen they have never walked through, who feel when they come to Scotland for the first time and step out of the car onto a Highland hillside, something moving in them that they cannot quite name. That feeling is the Glen reaching forward across the water, and the generations finding its people wherever they ended up. The land does not forget its own. Walk with me a little further. The most visible remnant of the cleared townships is what you see in the ground itself. Those long ridges and furrows we passed at the start of our walk, the run rig strips, the lazy beds, are remarkable things when you consider them. They survive because the soil was turned and built up so consistently for so long that the landscape was physically changed. In some places in the Highlands and Islands, you can see them from the air, stretching across entire hillsides, a kind of agricultural inscription pressed into the earth by generations of hands. The ground is shaped by those who worked it. Even when the workers are gone, the shaping remains. The Gaelic place names are another kind of record that has outlasted the people who have made them. Look at any detailed map of the Highlands and you will find them everywhere. Names that are not decorative labels, but descriptive sentences, each one a piece of precise observation. Alt Avasan, the burn of the hollow. Glen Moor, the big glen. Strun na Cria, the nose of the clay. Cora Vicaricha, the quarry of the son of Farquhar. Each name carries someone's act of attention, someone's careful noticing of this specific place, this particular quality of ground or water or light. They are the oldest archive in the Highlands, written not in ink but in sound, passed from mouth to mouth for hundreds of years. As the Gaelic speakers departed or died, the names remained on the maps but lost their living meaning. They became sounds without speakers, still beautiful, still precise, but spoken now mostly by people who did not know what they were saying. The grief in that is quiet and considerable, an entire vocabulary for understanding a landscape slowly becoming inaccessible in the land that produced it. And yet the thread held, the language did not die. There is a poem called Halig, written in Gaelic in 1954 by a poet named Sorley MacLean, who was born on the island of Rassie. Halig is a township on Rassie's eastern slope, cleared in the early 1850s. MacLean's own family were among those removed. The poem does not describe the clearance directly. It does something more quietly powerful. It imagines the cleared people still present in the landscape, not as ghosts exactly, but transformed into the birch and rowan and hazel that have grown up through the abandoned walls. The girls who once walked the village lane have become trees. The boys who herded cattle on the hill are the deer that graze there now. Time in the poem is layered, past and present, held in the same place at the same moment. The people somehow still, irreducibly, stubbornly there. The poem ends with an image of the sun going down over Duncana, the great hill of Rassie, and the deer on the high brae above Halig, like a shower of arrows, and with the sense that time and loss and love are all the same thing, bound together in the land, inseparable. When you stand in a cleared township at dusk, with the ruins low around you, and the trees growing up through the old walls, and the light going slowly from the sky, you understand what MacLean was reaching for. The land is full of presences, not frightening ones, just the weight of all the lives that were lived here, pressing gently upward through the ground, patient as the stone itself. Not everyone accepted what was happening without resistance. Through the 1870s and 1880s, the accumulated weight of dispossession and insecurity finally found its voice. Crofting communities across Skye and the mainland crowded onto coastal strips, with no security of tenure and rents that could be raised at any landlord's whim, began to organise. On the 19th of April 1882, on a hillside near Portree on the Isle of Skye, a place called the Braes, 50 police officers sent from Glasgow met a community that had decided quietly and collectively that enough was enough. The crofters of Braes had been denied access to their traditional grazing on a nearby hill called Ben Lee for years. They had petitioned, they had been refused, so they had simply taken their animals back to the hill and stopped paying rent. When the police arrived to arrest the ringleaders, the community came out to meet them. Stones were thrown, batons were raised, people on both sides were hurt. 5 crofters were arrested and later fined. But the news spread across Scotland and beyond. The image of Glasgow police officers beating men and women on a stony Skye hillside for the right to graze a handful of cattle struck the reading public as wrong to the bone. The sympathy that followed was enormous. The government appointed a commission of inquiry, the Napier Commission, which toured the crofting counties and heard from hundreds of ordinary people about what had been done to them and what they needed. In 1886, the Crofters Holding Scotland Act became law. Security of tenure, fair rents, the right to pass a croft to your children. It had taken 100 years of dispossession to reach that moment, and it was won not by lawyers or politicians, but by communities on the ground who had simply decided to hold their place. We have walked a long way together tonight. The moon has shifted while we have been talking, moving westward across the sky, the shadows of the hills moving with it. The burn still runs below us, unchanged, the same sound it has made through all the years we have been standing in. The heather is silver in the light. The air is cool and clean, carrying the faint sweetness of last season's bracken, the mineral sharpness of damp stone. Look around the ruins one more time before we rest. These low walls, these ridges in the ground, these silences, they are not only loss, they are record, they are testimony. Every stone that was laid here was laid by someone, and every field that was tilled by hands that knew this ground, the way you know the face of someone you love. The people who lived here were not simply victims of history. They were farmers and singers and storytellers. They were parents who carried children on cold mornings. They were young people who went to the shieling in summer and felt the world open out into light around them. They argued with each other over strip allocation and borrowed each other's tools and sang at weddings and sat with each other through illness. They were ordinary people living ordinary lives in a place that was entirely their own. They are not entirely gone. The Gaelic language is still spoken in the islands, on the coast, in classrooms and on radio, and in living rooms where grandparents sing to grandchildren. The community land trusts that now own parts of the Highlands, Assynt, Egg, Gia, Knoydart, are communities that have come home to themselves after a long absence, and they are tending their ground with care. The songs that were sung on these hillsides are still being sung, sometimes quietly at a kitchen table, sometimes in concert halls in Edinburgh and Cape Breton and Sydney. And the lazy beds are still here. The place names are still on the maps. The words are still scratched into the glass at Croick. James Loch, the estate commissioner who oversaw the Sutherland clearances, wrote that the children of those removed would lose all recollection of their father's habits and ways. He believed that. He was wrong. The memory held. It is holding still. And here, tonight, in this quiet glen, we are part of that holding. We have listened. We have paid attention. We have let the ground tell us what it carries. That is not nothing. That is, in its small way, everything. So rest now. Let the image of this glen settle softly around you. The pale moonlight on the heather, the burn running on below, unhurried. The old stone walls breathing quietly in the dark. The same walls that have stood through every kind of weather, every kind of sorrow, every kind of season. Let the names drift through you like smoke before sleep. Strathnaver, Glen, Rosal, Hallig, Pictou, Cape Breton. Let them move through you gently, the way waters move through stone, slowly, softly, leaving its mark without any effort at all. The glen is quiet tonight. The stars have their own patience, watching over all of this as they have always watched. The clachan when it was full of life, the strath when it burned, the shore when the boats pulled away, the empty hillside in the decades after, and now us, walking quietly through it, trying to understand, trying to remember. Somewhere beneath the heather, the memory of all those lives is resting too, not gone, just quiet, just waiting for someone to come along, as you have tonight, and listen. And if this quiet walk through Scotland's past has brought you something, comfort or connection, or simply a gentle place to rest, please consider sharing it. A like or a subscription helps these stories reach more people and keeps the fire burning a little longer. Sleep well from the fireside, from the Highlands, from the long and patient memory of Caledonia. Good night.